cold was not merely a condition of the air, it had seeped inward, settling into muscle and bone until it felt permanent. The man waited in that cold, unmoving, as though stillness itself might keep him alive. His breath rose in thin, uneven clouds, each one a quiet reminder that he was still here, still breathing, still subject to whatever would come next. Around him, the world had narrowed to fragments, trampled ground hardened by frost, the dull weight of his clothing soaked with sweat and fear, the distant metallic sounds of war that never truly faded. Time had lost its shape. There was only waiting. Waiting was not passive. It demanded every ounce of control he had left. His body wanted to recoil, to flee, to curl inward against the cold and the noise and the knowledge of where he was. But training, drilled into him long before this moment, kept him upright. Waiting was obedience in its purest form. It meant accepting that decisions were no longer his to make. Somewhere nearby, voices would soon rise, sharp and commanding, slicing through the air with authority. He had learned to expect those voices to carry anger, urgency, and consequence. Orders did not simply instruct, they condemned. Fear did not announce itself dramatically. It lived quietly behind his eyes, tightening his jaw, stiffening his hands. He had known fear before, during marches, under bombardment, in the long nights when sleep refused to come, but this was different. This was fear without motion, fear that had nowhere to go. It pooled inside him, fed by imagination and memory. He replayed what he had seen happen to others who stood where he now stood. Men reduced to silhouettes against smoke and fire, lives ended in seconds by decisions made elsewhere. The uncertainty was worse than pain. Pain, at least, was immediate. This waiting stretched endlessly, a suspended fall. The war had stripped him of context. He no longer thought in terms of causes or ideals. Those had belonged to another time, another version of himself who had believed the world could be understood through slogans and promises. Here, in this frozen pause, ideology felt distant and irrelevant. What remained was survival and the instinct to obey. He did not question why he was here or how the situation had unfolded. The war had taught him that questions were useless. Answers, when they came, arrived as commands or consequences. Around him, the environment seemed to conspire against comfort or clarity. The cold pressed in relentlessly, dulling sensation even as it heightened awareness. Every sound felt amplified. A distant engine, the crunch of boots on frozen ground, the indistinct clatter of equipment. Each noise carried potential meaning, and his mind latched onto them obsessively, trying to interpret what was coming. His shoulders remained tense, prepared for impact, physical or otherwise. The body learned quickly in war, adapting to the expectation of harm. He understood his place in the hierarchy of this moment. He was at the bottom, powerless and visible. Authority existed somewhere above him, unseen but absolute. It would speak soon, and when it did, there would be no negotiation. He had learned that authority in wartime did not need to explain itself. It demanded compliance, not understanding. The thought of being addressed filled him with a strange mix of dread and relief. Dread for what the orders might entail, relief that the waiting would finally end. This was how the war reshaped men. Not always through battle, but through moments like this, when identity dissolved under pressure. He was no longer defined by his past or his intentions. He was defined by his position in space and time, by the fact that he was cold, terrified, and waiting. The future existed only as a threat. Even survival felt provisional, something that could be revoked without warning. The cold deepened as minutes stretched on. His fingers ached despite the gloves meant to protect them, and he flexed them subtly, afraid that visible movement might be interpreted as defiance or panic. Discipline demanded stillness, and stillness demanded endurance. He focused on small things to anchor himself: the rhythm of his breathing, the weight of his boots pressing into the ground, the sensation of fabric against skin. These details grounded him, keeping his thoughts from spiraling completely out of control. Memory intruded despite his efforts. He remembered warmth, sunlight on open ground, the casual comfort of days that had not been structured around survival. Those memories felt unreal now, like stories borrowed from someone else's life. The contrast only sharpened his fear. The distance between who he had been and who he was now seemed immeasurable, crossed not gradually but violently. War did not allow for gentle transitions. He had been taught to expect cruelty. It was not always stated outright, but it was implied in training, reinforced by experience. Authority asserted itself through volume and force. Orders were screamed because screaming left no room for doubt. Compliance was ensured through fear, and fear was maintained through unpredictability. This logic had become so ingrained that he could not imagine an alternative. To him, power and brutality were inseparable. As he waited, his body prepared itself instinctively. Muscles tensed, jaw clenched, heart hammered against his ribs. He braced for humiliation, for violence, for the sudden narrowing of options that came with being commanded. He expected to be reduced further, stripped of whatever dignity he still possessed. In his mind, this was the natural progression of events. War moved in one direction only, toward greater loss. The landscape around him bore the marks of that progression. Scars in the earth, remnants of destruction, signs of lives disrupted and ended. Nothing here suggested mercy or restraint. Everything spoke of force applied without hesitation. The environment reinforced the narrative he had come to accept, that this was a place where humanity was secondary, if it existed at all. And so he stood, cold and terrified, waiting for orders to be screamed. The waiting itself became a test, a crucible that revealed how thoroughly the war had shaped him. He did not yet know that this moment would become something else entirely. At this point, there was no hint of reversal, no suggestion that the logic governing his fear might be challenged. There was only the expectation of what had always come before. In this suspended instant, the war appeared total and unyielding. It seemed to allow no deviation from its established patterns. He could not imagine that restraint might intervene, that the anticipated violence might be withheld. Such a possibility lay outside his experience, beyond the boundaries of what he believed possible. The future, as he understood it, was already written in the language of shouted commands. The expectation of being commanded had become as ingrained as breathing. Even before a voice was raised, his body anticipated it, responding to the idea of authority with tension and readiness. He did not need to hear the words to know their effect. Orders, when they came, would slice through hesitation and impose clarity through force. In war, clarity was rarely gentle. It arrived loud, abrupt, and absolute, leaving no room for doubt or dissent. He had learned that long ago, and that lesson now governed every reaction. His mind worked relentlessly, rehearsing outcomes that felt inevitable. If the order was to move, he would move without question. If it was to kneel, to drop his weapon, to step forward, he would comply. Resistance had been stripped from him not through a single act of violence, but through repetition. Over time, obedience had become a survival mechanism, reinforced by the knowledge that hesitation could be fatal. The anticipation of shouted commands was therefore not just fear of noise or authority, but fear of the consequences attached to delay. The unseen enemy occupied his thoughts more than the visible surroundings. Even without direct contact, the enemy existed as an ever-present threat, defined by uncertainty and imagination. He had been taught to see the opposing force not as individuals, but as a faceless mass capable of sudden, overwhelming violence. This abstraction intensified fear, because it allowed the mind to fill in gaps with worst-case scenarios. Every story he had heard, every rumor passed between exhausted men, fed into this mental construct. The enemy became less human and more like a force of nature, unpredictable and merciless. This perception shaped his understanding of authority as well. Authority, in his experience, mirrored the enemy in its unpredictability. It could be distant one moment and brutally immediate the next. Orders might come with explanation, or they might come with punishment attached. Either way, the expectation was that they would be enforced without hesitation. The man had learned to measure his own worth through compliance. To obey was to survive. To question was to risk everything. The psychological conditioning ran deep. Training had emphasized speed, precision, and submission to command above all else. There had been little space for moral reflection in those early days. Such reflection was framed as weakness, a liability in an environment where decisiveness was prized. Over time, this framework had narrowed his thinking. Complex situations were reduced to simple binaries: obey or suffer, act or be punished. In this waiting moment, that mental structure reasserted itself with force. Fear, once again, proved to be anticipatory rather than reactive. Nothing had happened yet, but his body behaved as though it already had. Muscles remained coiled, ready to respond instantly. His senses strained for cues, scanning the environment for signs of imminent command. The slightest change, a shift in sound, a movement at the edge of vision, triggered a surge of adrenaline. His heart responded as if each second might be the one that altered everything. This state of hypervigilance was exhausting, but it was familiar. The war had trained him to exist in this mode for extended periods, draining his energy while convincing him it was necessary. Rest felt dangerous. Relaxation felt irresponsible. Even in moments of apparent calm, the expectation of violence lingered. The anticipation of orders screamed was part of that lingering threat, a reminder that calm was always temporary. His fear was shared, though unspoken. Around him, others existed in similar states of readiness, their expressions controlled but tense. No one needed to articulate what they were waiting for. The collective silence spoke for itself. Each man understood that authority would soon break it, and when it did, individuality would vanish again. They would become a unit defined by movement and compliance rather than personal will. The broader machinery of the war loomed behind this moment. Decisions made far from this frozen ground had funneled down into this narrow space, compressing strategy into shouted commands delivered to trembling men. The scale of the conflict made individual experience feel insignificant, yet it was precisely through individuals that the war enacted itself. This contradiction deepened the man's sense of helplessness. He was essential and expendable at the same time. He reflected briefly on how fear had evolved since the beginning of the war. Early fear had been sharp and immediate, triggered by the unknown. Now it was more constant, a background presence that shaped every thought. It no longer surprised him, it simply existed. The anticipation of orders screamed fit neatly into this pattern. It was another known quantity in a world defined by uncertainty. This conditioning extended beyond the battlefield. Even in quieter moments, he found himself responding instinctively to raised voices or sudden sounds. Authority had rewired his reactions, training him to respond before thinking. In this sense, the war had followed him inward, altering his internal landscape as profoundly as it had scarred the physical one. The waiting now was not just external, it was internal, a constant readiness for command. The enemy, though unseen, felt close. Proximity was measured not by distance, but by potential. The possibility of interaction was enough to generate fear. He imagined what capture or confrontation might bring, based on what he had been told and what he had witnessed. These imaginings were not detailed fantasies, but fragmented impressions: shouts, blows, confusion, loss of control. The lack of clarity made them more frightening. In this mental space, restraint seemed unimaginable. Every story he knew reinforced the idea that contact with the enemy meant violence. Even when prisoners were taken, the process was described as harsh and dehumanizing. Mercy, if it existed at all, was treated as an exception too rare to rely upon. The man had internalized this narrative completely. It shaped his expectations and justified his fear. Authority, therefore, represented both order and threat. It imposed structure on chaos, but at the cost of autonomy. The anticipation of shouted orders was tied to this duality. On one hand, orders would end the uncertainty of waiting. On the other, they would initiate a new phase of risk. This tension made the waiting unbearable. He found himself torn between wanting the moment to arrive and fearing its arrival. The war's broader moral landscape remained obscured. In this moment, there was no room for ethical consideration, no space to question right or wrong. The immediate reality demanded focus on survival. This narrowing of perspective was one of the war's most profound effects. By reducing complex human experiences to a series of commands and reactions, it simplified the world in ways that were both efficient and devastating. As time passed, the expectation of being ordered became almost ritualistic. It marked the rhythm of wartime existence. Wait, receive command, act, endure consequences, repeat. The man's identity had been reshaped to fit this cycle. He measured time not in hours or days, but in intervals between commands. The current interval stretched on, heavy with expectation. This shared anticipation bound the men together even as it isolated them individually. Each was alone with his fear, yet united by the knowledge that they would all respond in the same way when the moment came. The war relied on this predictability. It depended on men who would act reflexively, without hesitation or reflection. The man understood this, even if he could not articulate it fully. In the stillness, he felt the weight of what he had become. Not a thinker, not a chooser, but a responder. The anticipation of orders screamed had trained him to exist in a perpetual state of readiness, his will subordinated to external command. This was the war's quiet triumph, not just the capture of territory, but the capture of minds. He waited, braced for the sound that would shatter the silence. In his understanding of the world, that sound would bring violence, humiliation, or loss. He could not conceive of an alternative. The expectation itself had become a prison, shaping his emotions and reactions before anything had actually happened. This was the power of fear sustained by anticipation. The moment stretched beyond its expected breaking point. What should have arrived instantly, shouting, aggression, the sharp collapse of uncertainty into command, did not come. Silence, instead of violence, filled the space, and that silence was heavier than any sound he had known. His body remained locked in readiness, muscles taut, breath shallow, waiting for the impact that experience had taught him was unavoidable. Yet nothing happened. The absence itself became disorienting, as if the war had briefly forgotten its own rules. At first, he assumed it was a delay, a tactical pause before the inevitable. Authority, he believed, rarely revealed itself gently. He remained motionless, bracing for the sudden eruption that would confirm everything he feared. Seconds passed, then more. The cold bit deeper, and with it came a creeping sense of confusion. His mind struggled to reconcile this stillness with the expectations ingrained in him. This was not how such moments unfolded. Something was wrong, not externally, but in the logic he had relied upon to survive. When voices finally emerged, they lacked the violence he had prepared for. They were firm, controlled, measured. There was no frenzy, no rage spilling over into sound. The tone carried authority without cruelty, precision without humiliation. This difference struck him more forcefully than a shouted command ever could have. His body reacted before his mind could process it, a subtle loosening of tension mixed with heightened alertness. He listened closely, uncertain whether this restraint was genuine or merely another tactic. The unfamiliarity unsettled him. War had conditioned him to interpret restraint as weakness or deception. He searched for signs of imminent reversal, expecting the calm to shatter at any moment. But it did not. The behavior he observed remained consistent, disciplined rather than explosive. Control replaced chaos, and in that shift, his internal framework began to fracture. The enemy he had constructed in his mind no longer aligned with the reality before him. This pause forced him inward. Without the immediate pressure of shouted orders, thought crept back into a space long dominated by reflex. He became aware of his own reactions, of how deeply he had internalized the assumption that violence was inevitable. The realization was unsettling. He had not merely expected brutality, he had accepted it as natural. The restraint now confronting him exposed how thoroughly fear had shaped his understanding of the world. The British presence asserted itself through order rather than intimidation. Movements were deliberate, not rushed. Instructions were conveyed with clarity instead of volume. The absence of unnecessary force created a strange psychological vacuum. Without terror to guide his reactions, he was left uncertain how to feel or respond. The war had trained him for extremes, not for moderation. This unexpected professionalism disrupted the emotional rhythm he had relied on to endure. He found himself observing details he would have otherwise missed. Faces were focused but not hostile, expressions shaped by duty rather than hatred. Actions followed structure, suggesting a system that valued control over domination. This did not erase the reality of captivity or danger, but it altered its texture. Fear did not vanish, but it shifted, losing some of its sharpness and becoming something more complex. The man struggled to process what this restraint implied. If violence was not automatic, then perhaps it was a choice. This idea unsettled him deeply. Choice introduced moral weight where he had been taught to see only necessity. The war, as he had experienced it, justified brutality as unavoidable. Here, restraint suggested an alternative, that even within conflict, decisions could be guided by principle rather than impulse. This realization challenged more than his expectations of the enemy. It challenged his understanding of authority itself. He had equated power with volume and fear, believing that control required domination. The British restraint demonstrated a different model, one where authority was maintained through discipline and predictability. This form of power felt quieter but no less effective. In some ways, it felt more formidable, precisely because it did not rely on chaos. His body responded slowly, cautiously, as though afraid that acknowledging the change might invite punishment. He remained tense, but the edge of panic dulled. The constant anticipation of pain eased slightly, replaced by wary curiosity. He wondered how long this restraint would last, whether it was situational or systemic. The uncertainty remained, but it was no longer purely terrifying. It had become intellectually unsettling. Memory resurfaced again, but differently this time. He recalled moments earlier in the war when he had glimpsed restraint, brief, fragile instances quickly overshadowed by violence. At the time, he had dismissed them as anomalies. Now, faced with sustained discipline, those memories took on new significance. They suggested that brutality was not the only possible outcome, even if it was the most common. The moral landscape of the war began to blur. Clear divisions between good and evil, friend and enemy, seemed less absolute. This did not absolve anyone of responsibility, nor did it erase the suffering he had witnessed. But it complicated the narrative he had relied on to make sense of his fear. The enemy, once reduced to a caricature of cruelty, now appeared governed by rules he had not expected. This complication was deeply uncomfortable. Simplified narratives had provided psychological shelter, allowing him to endure without constant moral conflict. Restraint dismantled that shelter. It demanded that he acknowledge nuance at a moment when he felt least equipped to do so. The war, which had stripped away complexity to function efficiently, now reintroduced it unexpectedly. He became aware of a subtle shift in how he perceived himself. No longer merely an object awaiting violence, he felt momentarily recognized as a human being subject to control rather than destruction. This distinction mattered more than he could immediately articulate. It did not guarantee safety, but it restored a fragment of dignity he had assumed was lost. That restoration was fragile, tentative, but real. The pause extended, and with it the space for reflection widened. He considered how different this moment felt from those governed by shouted commands. Fear had not disappeared, but it no longer consumed all mental bandwidth. There was room now for observation, for thought, for the uneasy realization that the war's logic was not as absolute as he had believed. This realization did not bring comfort so much as disorientation. If restraint was possible here, why had it been absent elsewhere? The question lingered without answer, heavy and unresolved. It forced him to confront the randomness of mercy in wartime, the way ethical behavior could appear inconsistently, shaped by culture, leadership, and circumstance rather than universal principle. He sensed that something irreversible was happening within him. The certainty that had sustained his fear was eroding. In its place grew a more complex awareness of human behavior under pressure. The war was no longer a single, monolithic force, but a collection of choices made by individuals operating within systems. This perspective did not diminish the war's brutality, but it reframed it. As restraint continued, its impact deepened. The absence of immediate violence became a statement in itself, more powerful than any shouted command. It demonstrated that authority could be exercised without surrendering control to cruelty. This demonstration lingered in his mind, reshaping his expectations not just of the present moment, but of what was possible even in conflict. As the minutes passed without escalation, fear began to change shape. It did not vanish, nor did it retreat entirely, but it loosened its grip just enough for other sensations to surface. The man became aware of how tightly he had been holding himself, how rigid his posture had grown under the expectation of sudden violence. Now, almost involuntarily, that rigidity softened. His shoulders dropped a fraction, his breathing deepened slightly, and the constant tremor beneath his skin eased. This subtle physical shift marked a profound internal change, one he did not immediately trust. He watched carefully, alert for signs that this restraint was temporary. Experience had taught him that calm could be deceptive, that moments of quiet often preceded chaos. Yet the behavior around him remained consistent. Movements were deliberate, unhurried, governed by structure rather than impulse. There was no performative dominance, no need to assert control through intimidation. Authority existed here as something contained, measured, and intentional. The contrast with what he had known before was stark. With fear no longer overwhelming every thought, his perception sharpened. He noticed faces more clearly now, registering expressions that were focused but not cruel, serious but not contemptuous. These were not the expressions of men intoxicated by power. They reflected duty, perhaps even fatigue, but also restraint. This observation unsettled him. He had learned to survive by flattening the enemy into a single, terrifying image. Now that image fractured, revealing complexity where he had expected uniform hostility. The shift forced him into an uncomfortable awareness of his own assumptions. He realized how thoroughly he had internalized a worldview in which brutality was the default state of war. This belief had protected him, in a way. It simplified reality, allowing him to prepare for the worst without question. But as restraint persisted, that simplification began to feel inadequate. The world before him no longer aligned with the one he had constructed in his mind. This dissonance produced a quiet internal conflict. Part of him resisted the change, clinging to the certainty of fear because certainty felt safer than ambiguity. Another part, however, responded to the restraint with cautious relief. That part recognized the difference between control and cruelty, between authority exercised to maintain order and authority wielded to dominate. The distinction mattered deeply, even if he could not yet articulate why. As fear receded slightly, other emotions emerged: confusion, curiosity, and a faint, almost unwelcome sense of relief. Relief itself felt dangerous, as though acknowledging it might invite punishment. He had learned not to hope in war. Hope had a way of collapsing under the weight of reality. Yet here, restraint created a small space where hope could exist, however fragile. That space unsettled him more than fear ever had. The moral reversal taking place was subtle but profound. Those he had been conditioned to fear were now demonstrating a form of discipline that challenged his understanding of strength. Power, he realized, did not have to announce itself loudly to be effective. In fact, this quiet control felt more formidable than chaos. It suggested confidence, organization, and an adherence to principles that did not require constant reinforcement through violence. This realization forced him to reconsider the narratives he had absorbed throughout the war. Propaganda, rumors, and selective stories had painted the enemy in absolute terms. Such narratives thrived on exaggeration and dehumanization. They were tools designed to sustain fear and justify aggression. Standing here now, confronted with restraint, he felt the fragility of those narratives. They had not prepared him for this moment. The awareness extended inward as well. He began to see how fear had narrowed his own moral vision. In expecting cruelty, he had surrendered the possibility of nuance. He had accepted a version of the world in which ethics were irrelevant, overridden by necessity. Restraint challenged that acceptance. It suggested that even in war, choices remained, and that those choices carried moral weight. He became acutely aware of his own humanity in this moment. Not in a triumphant or affirming sense, but in a vulnerable one. Without the immediate threat of violence, he felt exposed, uncertain how to position himself emotionally. Fear had provided a kind of armor, however painful. Its loosening left him unprotected, forced to confront the reality of being seen and treated as a person rather than a target. This vulnerability made him more observant, more sensitive to the dynamics unfolding around him. He noticed how instructions were given with clarity rather than contempt, how compliance was expected but not extracted through humiliation. These details accumulated, each one reinforcing the sense that restraint here was not accidental. It was deliberate, embedded in a system that valued order over spectacle. The implications of this realization rippled outward. If restraint could exist here, then brutality elsewhere was not inevitable. This thought disturbed him deeply. It suggested that much of what he had witnessed, the suffering, the degradation, the loss of dignity, was not simply the product of war itself, but of choices made within it. This recognition carried a heavy moral weight, one that he was not prepared to fully confront. His fear transformed again, becoming less about immediate harm and more about uncertainty. The familiar patterns he relied on to interpret danger no longer applied. He could not predict behavior based solely on past experience. This unpredictability was unsettling in a different way. It required attentiveness rather than reflex, thought rather than instinct. The war, which had trained him to react automatically, now demanded a level of awareness he had long suppressed. He found himself reassessing the meaning of authority. Previously, authority had been synonymous with threat. It had existed to compel obedience through fear. Here, authority functioned differently. It maintained control through consistency and restraint, reducing the need for constant enforcement. This model challenged his belief that fear was the most effective tool of power. It suggested that discipline, when applied evenly, could be just as commanding. This realization extended to his understanding of himself. He saw how deeply his identity had been shaped by submission to fear-based authority. His sense of self-worth had become tied to compliance and endurance. Now, confronted with a different form of control, he felt unmoored. He was no longer sure how to define his place in this moment. The war had taught him who to be under violence. It had not prepared him for restraint. The passage of time reinforced the change. Each moment that passed without escalation strengthened the sense that something fundamental had shifted. Fear did not disappear, but it lost its absolute authority over his thoughts. In its place grew a cautious awareness of complexity. The war, he realized, was not a single experience but many, shaped by the values and decisions of those who wielded power within it. This awareness did not absolve anyone, nor did it erase the suffering he had endured or witnessed. Instead, it deepened his understanding of that suffering. It revealed how easily cruelty could be normalized, how quickly restraint could be abandoned when fear and ideology dominated. Standing here now, he felt the weight of that knowledge settle over him, heavy and unresolved. The moral reversal was not dramatic or cathartic. It did not arrive with clarity or resolution. Instead, it unfolded quietly, reshaping his perceptions piece by piece. He was not transformed into an optimist or a believer in the war's redeemability. Rather, he became a witness to the fact that alternatives existed, even if they were fragile and rare. This witnessing altered him. It introduced doubt where certainty had once ruled. It complicated the emotional armor he had relied upon to survive. The man remained cautious, aware that circumstances could change without warning. Yet something within him had shifted irreversibly. He could no longer see the world through the same simplified lens. As restraint continued, it left an imprint deeper than fear ever had. It challenged him to recognize humanity in a place defined by its absence. That recognition was painful, unsettling, and incomplete, but it was real. In the midst of war's brutality, this moment of controlled power carved out a space where moral reflection could exist. The man stood within that space, uncertain and exposed, aware that he was experiencing something rare. Fear had not vanished, but it no longer told the whole story. For the first time in a long while, the war's logic felt interrupted, and in that interruption, everything he thought he knew began to shift. The aftermath of restraint lingered far longer than the moment itself. Once the immediate tension passed, It left behind a complicated emotional residue that the man could neither dismiss nor fully comprehend. The war had conditioned him to measure experiences by physical outcomes. Injury avoided, survival secured, but this encounter defied such simple accounting. Nothing visible had happened, yet internally, everything felt unsettled. The absence of brutality echoed louder in his mind than violence ever had. Shame surfaced first, quietly and unexpectedly. It was not imposed from outside but rose from within, rooted in the assumptions he had carried so confidently. He felt ashamed of how certain he had been that cruelty was inevitable, how readily he had reduced others to monsters in order to make sense of his fear. That certainty had once felt necessary, even righteous. Now it appeared brittle, exposed by restraint that required no explanation. The shame was not overwhelming, but it was persistent, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. Relief followed close behind, though it felt almost forbidden. He had survived without being diminished, without being subjected to the humiliation or violence he had braced for. This relief did not manifest as joy or gratitude. It was subdued, cautious, as though acknowledging it too openly might tempt fate. Still, it was undeniable. His body recognized safety before his mind dared to name it. Muscles relaxed further, breath deepened, and the constant ache of anticipation eased. Confusion bound these emotions together. He struggled to reconcile what he had experienced with everything he believed he knew about war and enemies. The restraint he witnessed did not fit neatly into the narratives that had sustained him. It contradicted the stories passed down through ranks, the warnings repeated until they hardened into truth. If those stories were incomplete or distorted, what else had he accepted without question? The confusion was destabilizing, eroding the psychological shortcuts he had relied on to endure. The encounter forced him to confront the role propaganda had played in shaping his expectations. He realized how selectively information had been presented to him, how fear had been cultivated as a tool. This realization did not make him naive or trusting overnight, but it made him skeptical in a way he had not been before. Skepticism itself felt dangerous in wartime, a luxury he could scarcely afford. Yet it had been awakened nonetheless. He began to reflect on how restraint had affected him more deeply than overt aggression ever could have. Violence, brutal as it was, followed predictable patterns. It confirmed expectations, reinforced fear, and justified emotional withdrawal. Restraint, by contrast, disrupted those patterns. It demanded engagement, reflection, and moral reckoning. It denied him the comfort of certainty, replacing it with ambiguity that lingered long after the moment had passed. This ambiguity reshaped his sense of responsibility. If the enemy could choose restraint, then perhaps individuals retained agency even within the machinery of war. This thought was unsettling, because it implied that atrocities were not solely the product of circumstance but also of decision. It suggested that the line between necessity and cruelty was thinner than he had believed. Acknowledging this possibility felt like a burden, one he was unsure how to carry. He thought of moments earlier in the war when he had witnessed or participated in acts he had justified as unavoidable. At the time, fear and obedience had silenced doubt. Now, restraint reopened those memories, casting them in a harsher light. He did not condemn himself outright, but he could no longer dismiss the moral weight of those actions so easily. The war had demanded compliance, but it had not erased responsibility entirely. This realization weighed heavily on him. The psychological impact extended beyond moral reflection. It altered his relationship with fear itself. Fear had once been a constant companion, guiding his reactions and decisions. It had been painful, but also clarifying. Now, fear felt less absolute. It remained present, but it no longer dictated every response. In its place grew a cautious awareness that outcomes were not always predetermined. This awareness was unsettling, because it introduced hope alongside risk. Hope, however fragile, complicated his emotional landscape. He had learned to suppress it because hope made loss more painful. Yet restraint had allowed a small seed of it to take root. He wondered whether this moment was unique or part of a broader pattern. Could restraint exist elsewhere, or was it merely an exception that proved the rule? The uncertainty kept him awake, replaying the encounter in his mind, searching for meaning. He also felt a strange sense of isolation. The transformation he experienced was internal and largely invisible. Others around him might have interpreted the moment differently or not at all. There was no shared language for this kind of psychological shift, no ritual or acknowledgement. The war recognized physical wounds and acts of bravery, not quiet moral upheavals. He carried this change alone, unsure whether it would be understood or dismissed if spoken aloud. The confusion extended to his perception of the enemy as a whole. He knew better than to generalize from a single experience, yet the image he had constructed could not be restored to its former simplicity. He could no longer imagine the opposing side as uniformly cruel or devoid of principle. This did not erase the reality of violence elsewhere, but it fractured the totalizing narrative he had relied upon. The enemy became human again, and that humanity complicated everything. This complication did not bring comfort. In many ways, it made the war harder to bear. Simplicity had offered emotional protection, allowing him to endure without constant moral conflict. Now that protection was gone. He found himself more sensitive to nuance, more aware of contradictions. The war's brutality felt heavier when viewed through this lens, not lighter. He grappled with the question of whether restraint was more powerful than violence.